people will continue to come on as we start. Welcome everybody who is here tonight at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia's Winter Speaker Series, virtual Winter Speaker Series. I'm Beth Hessel, your Executive Director, and you can see also on screen Tess Galen, who is our wonderful events coordinator. Most of you have worked with her in getting registered and you received your link from Tess. She helps everything run smoothly. And our speaker and moderator this evening, I'll introduce to you in a moment. If it is your first time coming to our programs, we are so pleased that you are here to join us. The Athenaeum of Philadelphia is a circulating library, research institution, and community incubator and forum where we celebrate great speakers, great writers, great thinkers, professionals, architects, artists, and love to gather together to learn and converse and strengthen community. We continue to do that online. And we invite you, if you love what we are doing, to consider joining us, becoming a member of our community. Before I introduce our speakers, I'll let you know once I've introduced them, Tess is going to put them on Spotlight. So you should see both Brad and Stephen on the screen, and they'll have a moderated conversation. You can, at any time you have a question, you can put them in either the Q&A or the chat section. I will be checking those, and at the end, I will lead the Q&A time to get your questions answered. Tonight, it's very, very exciting. Our talk tonight is from one of Athenaeum's members, Bradford Pearson, who did much of his writing at the desk by the one electrical outlet we have in our library. So it's been fun to, before the pandemic, to get to see Brad writing away, working away at the Athenaeum on his book, and hear how it was coming along, and to see it come to fruition and be published this past week. He's getting a lot of attention for his book. Now, Brad is the former features editor of the Southwest, the magazine, and he's written for a variety of high-level publications, including the New York Times, Esquire, Time, and Salon. He grew up in Hyde Park in New York and now lives in Philadelphia. When you read his acknowledgments, he talks a little bit about that and the connections between Hyde Park, Roosevelt, and his work. He's written about everything, he says in his bio, from magicians and 21st century technology to his own kidnapping. And The Eagles of Heart Mountain is his first book. We're really excited to be able to celebrate this first book by one of our own members. And moderating the conversation with Brad tonight is another one of Athenaeum's members, and someone we're proud to claim as our own, Stephen Ujifusa, who is a historian and a resident of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In 2012, Stephen's first book, A Man and His Ship, America's Greatest Naval Architect in His Quest to Build the SS United States, won the Athenaeum's Literary Award. It was also named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the year. So it made a good bit of a splash there. He also had a second book, Barons of the Sea, their race to build the world's fastest clipper ship, and is currently working on a book about Jewish immigration from Russia to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. So we look forward to that book being published too and bringing you here to talk about that. Tonight, it is just exciting to know that you two gentlemen are going to be in conversation about Brad's book, which is a topic actually, as he and I have talked about. The Japanese American incarceration was the topic of my own doctoral dissertation. So it's been wonderful to read his book, and I look forward to hearing more in this conversation. I know you all are also. So I'm going to turn it over now to Stephen and Brad, and invite all of you to join me in virtually welcoming these two gentlemen to our virtual speaker series.
Thank you so much, Beth, and Brad, congratulations on the publication of your fantastic book. It really tells a story that deserves to be told, especially now, given the current climate. And it's a story that touches my family. My dad's family was from Wyoming, and they are Japanese American. And by a weird fluke of fate, my great-grandfather left Japantown in San Francisco in 1905 and worked on the railroad all the way out into Wyoming and bought a farm there. And in 1942, about 10,000 Japanese Americans arrived 90 miles from our family farm in Worland, Wyoming. And one of my dad's earliest memories is seeing a group of farm workers show up at the house. It turned out they were workers from the Heart Mountain camp who were earning some money. And my great grandfather, Shuichi Ujifusa, was able to visit people he knew from Japantown in San Francisco who are now incarcerated, drive 90 miles, drive through barbed wire gates and machine guns and whatnot, and see them and then drive out. So it's something that touched my father's life, something I heard a lot about. But Brad, can you please tell everyone, where did you get the idea for this book? I'm sure you've been asked this before, but what grabbed you about this story?
Yeah, well, Steve, thanks for doing this, and thanks for everyone for attending. I know that there's a lot of other stuff going on right now that is probably pulling your attention in other ways, so I really appreciate it. So this book came to me in a very bizarre and sort of odd happenstance, in that 2013, I was working on a story about Yellowstone, and I was in Wyoming, and one of the people who I was out there with said, oh, why don't we go visit the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center? It's where the former camp was. And so I went out expecting, I'm not really sure what I expected, but I thought that I knew a decent amount about Japanese American incarceration. But I walked out of the museum completely floored and realizing that I knew about a puddle's worth of information here about this. And there was one very specific thing that stuck out to me when I was there. And on one of the displays, there was a very brief mention of the Heart Mountain Eagles, the high school football team at the camp. And I have it memorized, but I won't say it because it's super specific and would give away the ending of the book. But it was such a fascinating little bit of information that it kind of stuck in my head. And as every other reporter knows, that the stories that you find most interesting and most fascinating are the ones that you can't stop thinking about when you're working on other stories. So when I was writing the Yellowstone story, I was like, oh, okay, I loved going to Yellowstone. Then as I was working on more and more stories over the years, this one idea just kept popping up into my head, which was to start investigating and start to learn more about this high school football team that was at a, oddly enough, a concentration camp of Japanese Americans in the middle of Wyoming. So that was kind of where the seed came from. And then at night when I was working other jobs, I would just start sort of pulling at threads, and I would, I would learn a little bit more about the camp. I would buy a book. There's been a lot of great books written by one historian in Wyoming named Mike Mackey, just about the Heart Mountain camp. And that was really helpful in terms of developing my basic level of understanding about what was going on here at the camp. And then from there, I just started reaching out to families. I was aided by one gentleman who works or is a volunteer and a member of the board at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, sent me a CD with all of the Heart Mountain Sentinels, which is a weekly newspaper at the camp, every single issue of that. So I was able to go through and start developing a sort of a roster of the players and the families that I wanted to talk to. And then, everything sort of snowballed. I got one family, the sort of one of the main characters in the book is a man named Babe Nomura. And I found, he unfortunately passed away, but I found his daughter, I found her email address on an old LinkedIn page and sort of sent her an email and said, you don't know me and this sounds a little crazy. I'm just a guy who's sort of finds your dad fascinating. Would you like to, can I give you a call? And everything sort of snowballed from there. So
could you talk a bit more about Babe Nomura, because you sort of came into this at just the right time, because the Issei, or the first generation, they're all dead now, the first generation immigrants who were incarcerated. But the second generation, the Nisei, those who were born in the United States and United States citizens who were uprooted from their homes,
right,
and lost everything, their families, their community, their property, everything, and moved to these desolate camps. They're dying off now. You caught this just in the nick of time. Can you tell me a bit more about, Babe Nomura, this star athlete who was uprooted and became this football star in the concentration camp in the middle of Wyoming?
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head, where I was able to interview one living player, and the most of the other interviews I did were with players, either their children, or I was able to speak with a few widows as well, which was really helpful in terms of sketching out the book, especially since some of the widows that I spoke with were also incarcerated at Heart Mountain. That's where they met their husbands, actually. But Babe, I mean, it's everything that I say is going to sound, like hyperbole, but, I was able to dig through the old Los Angeles Times and the Los Angeles Daily News and all these old newspapers from before the war and sort of track this athlete's trajectory. And by going through his family archives and seeing awards that he won in the decathlon in 8th grade and basketball tournaments in 9th grade and playing against 20 and 30-year-olds in baseball leagues when he was 14 and 15 years old, and being named to citywide all-star teams, despite the fact that he was only a teenager playing against grown men. He was, and a lot of people have said this isn't just me, that he was probably the greatest all-around Japanese-American athlete of the Nisei generation. And that was sort of born in this cauldron of Japanese-American sports in Los Angeles. So there were these separate leagues that were established, and lots of different ethnic communities in Los Angeles had this at the time. There were Chinese leagues, Japanese leagues, all up and down the West Coast.
They created this whole sort of sports subculture
and a whole infrastructure established, all the way from youth sports all the way up until you were 40, and you're I don't want to say it because I'm pretty close to 40 now, but until your body gave out. But and that was where Babe sort of cut his teeth in baseball, softball, basketball. And then when he got to high school, it kind of became clear that he was the best in LA in these Japanese American leagues. And so he decided to start playing football. And that was when he sort of went out on his own. He was the only Japanese American player at the Hollywood High School. And that was, Hollywood High, probably one of the most famous high schools in America and most famous neighborhood in America. And that was where he really started to make his name. And he worked his way up. He dominated the JV team and played one season of varsity before he got sent to camp. So. And
to get back to the impetus of incarceration. So you have the first generation, the Issei, trying to preserve the culture as they knew it while trying to be American. A lot of them, had to learn English quickly. But then the Nisei, like Babe Nomura and the football players who you write about, they are like trying to, on one hand, listen to their parents about like being Japanese, but then they feel this immense pull, like so many other immigrants, to be American. And football and also baseball was kind of this entree to Americanism.
Right.
But then you have incarceration, you have this uprooting. Can you talk about, there was the military aspect, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and you have people like Secretary of War Stimson, and all the way on down to General DeWitt in California saying these people represent a security threat. Right. But then you also have this other thing where you have these nativist groups, this infrastructure of nativist groups in California that have been around for a long time, that have been sort of hoping for this for a while. Can you tell me about the follow the money aspect of this and how it destroyed the lives of these families?
Yeah, I think, and I've mentioned this, in the book, and I've mentioned it a few times in other interviews where, Pearl Harbor is just this sort of the precipitating event that Pearl Harbor basically just gave the white government the go ahead to say like, oh, let's do all these things we've wanted to do for decades anyway, which is the Japanese in California, since the time they got there, basically just became a dominant agricultural force in the state. And, I think by the 1920s, they had about 85% of the potato market in the state of California. And then that spread to watermelons, asparagus, lettuce, flowers. And it got to the point where you're having these congressional hearings and statewide hearings about alien land laws and about immigration quotas and things like that, where white farmers and ranchers were showing up and they were in tears saying, we can't, our land has been taken from us. And it's there's a certain level of irony there where the Japanese immigrants came in and really, really toiled and worked these farms owned by these white ranchers, and then just gained enough financial and somewhat, societal clout to be able to just say like, oh no, we're much better at this than you are. So we're just gonna strike out on our own. And there were a lot of times where they would accept payment in land that white farmers thought wasn't valuable. So whether it be, old stony fields or in the San Joaquin Delta, where it was just, they had a lot of the white farmers in California and Oregon and Washington had no idea the land that they were truly sitting on. But the Japanese agricultural history in Japan itself always made a lot with very little land on very rocky soil. So they were able to basically come in and really put a foothold in the West Coast agricultural market. So then when Pearl Harbor came, sort of all these white farmer associations and groups, like you said, nativist groups like the Native Sons of the Golden West and the Asiatic Exclusion League, groups like that had been for years trying to cut off and successfully cutting off East Asian immigration, finally saw their opportunity to say, okay, let's get all of these Japanese and Japanese Americans off the land, which is what they somehow convinced the military was of true importance, while the military basically ignored all of its own reports, all of its own intelligence reports, either ignored them purposefully or ignored them, just because they were seemingly, they knew what they wanted, they knew what they wanted the end result to be, and that was to remove 120,000 people from the West Coast. And, the effects of that is that after the war, you have folks who owned 50 acres or 100 acres or, even just smaller plots of land that they come back to the West Coast and they're gardeners in Beverly Hills because they can't buy their land back. They don't have any money because they've sold their land for pennies on the dollar before they left because they
had 36 hours to sell everything.
Yeah.
When the executive order from President Roosevelt came through, and They had to report to the Santa Anita racetrack. Can you sort of describe that? Talk about sort of the actual uprooting process of these 110, 20,000 Americans of Japanese descent and their movement to camp, and then how the football team started at Heart Mountain. Can you sort of talk about that process of trying to recreate in very desolate, hard surroundings this sports infrastructure, this sports culture?
Yeah. And that was, like you said, and that was basically the executive order comes in, and then they start the first community that gets removed is Bainbridge Island in Washington. And then, there was all these exclusion zones that the government just started picking and saying, okay, this neighborhood in LA is going to go next, this neighborhood in Mountain View, this neighborhood outside of Portland, all the way down to the Mexican border. And so people like Babe and George Yoshinaga and all the other Eagles have a certain number of hours or days to say, okay, I'm going to say goodbye to all my friends who, were white kids or Mexican kids or other, Chinese kids, and just say, here you go. Here's my basketball. Here's my bike. You guys can divvy up my baseball gloves, because all I can take with me is the stuff I can put on my back, basically the stuff I can carry in my arms. So then, from there were these temporary, they called them temporary assembly centers. And that was, sort of the WRA and the federal government speak it was this sort of way station in between when the federal government hadn't constructed any of the permanent camps, had no idea what they were really doing. So for Babe and then for Horse, they end up at Santa Anita racetrack. A bunch of the folks there are living in horse stalls, or they're living underneath the grandstands. They're living in makeshift barracks. There's no schooling.
Squalid conditions.
Yeah, it's terrible conditions. I mean, literally living, in horse stalls. You can't get the smell of horse. Anybody who's ever been in a horse stall would say, like, no matter how much bleach or whitewash you're going to do in here, you're still living in a place that used to, be covered in horse feces. So, but I think that was, when they were at Santa Anita, that was when the Japanese American community sort of planted the first seeds of how they were going to survive the next 4 years. And that was at Santa Anita, especially. They had this large field on the infield where there were baseball leagues and softball leagues, and They had female judo clubs and things like that, where they just said, okay, we're going to try to make the best of this situation. It's a terrible situation. We wish we weren't in it, but there's no one stopping us right now from, from playing baseball. They're stopping them from doing a lot of other stuff, which was reading books in Japanese or listening to records in Japanese and confiscating anything that seemed, Japanese and not American. But pretty quickly, the federal government realized that I don't know how to put it, that not necessarily the easiest way to handle this, but there had to be a certain level of self-government and that the Japanese Americans were allowed to have if they didn't want just constant riots, which there was one riot at Santa Anita, which I talk about in the book. So then, once they get to Heart Mountain, it's a similar thing where it's just ground up. And, very early on, one of the first things that they do when they get to Heart Mountain, 10,000 people show up and they're living in a barrack.
Describe the landscape of Heart Mountain.
Oh, sure.
What's the setting like?
Yeah. I mean, all of the camps, every camp was picked basically because it had been completely passed over by every other settler or any other group. Even some of them in Arizona specifically had native tribes on them at some point. But Heart Mountain itself was so desolate and it was so cold. It would be, negative 30 in the winter. It would get up to over 100 in the summer, flat land, no vegetation, no trees to block any wind. So the wind comes up and over the mountains and just causes these wild blizzards that could take a few inches of snow and bury a house.
They're living in these very crude dormitory, shacks, basically. They were hastily erected. These were not.
They basically,
good for the climate.
When they were building these houses, they basically convinced anyone that was in, Nebraska or Wyoming to come here with, and say like, help build these camps. And some of the barracks were built in less than an hour. If they laid out all the lumber, the carpenters can get the barrack up in an hour. And they used green wood, which meant that by the time that everybody showed up at the end of August 1942, the wood had started to dry, which meant that there were holes in every single barrack. And the first snow fell in September in Wyoming. So you have folks who are coming from Southern California, most of whom have the temperature. I went back and looked through the temperature records for Southern California from Babe's birthday. So in the mid 20s, all the way up till when he went to Heart Mountain to just try to see what the lowest temperature was that he'd ever witnessed in his life. And it had never dipped below freezing in LA. And then within weeks of showing up, it's snowing in Heart Mountain. Nobody has winter coats. And their houses that they're supposed to be living in have holes in them. So they have to fill them with newspaper and pieces out of the Sears Roebuck catalog.
No privacy because they're divided.
No privacy. The dorms, basically, they built a barracks and they're 100 feet long, but there's multiple families in these walled off sections. But the walls don't go up to the ceiling. So basically, everyone's talking on top of each other. You have families of 5 that are living in a room with a sheet in between them, and these are Americans. This is how we treated our fellow citizens, and their parents who were denied citizenship for the decades leading up to camp.
Well, out of these terrible conditions, Nomura and the others, a lot of the young men in this group decide to form a football league. And not only form a football league, they decide we're going to play the local high schools in this area. Now, football is an institution in Wyoming. It's kind of like a religion. Everyone plays football. People drive, it's kind of like Texas. People will drive for hours to play a football game. So this is kind of an ultimate test in many ways of football as an American sport in this desolate setting. And you have some young Nisei saying, we're going to play the local teams. How'd that come about? I'd also imagine that a lot of the white towns were not particularly happy about this.
Yeah.
About the prospect of playing these Nisei.
Right. So like I said at the top, after a little while, the camp officials realized that the best way to have a camp that was fairly orderly. Obviously they were surrounded by barbed wire and guns, so there was only going to be so much disorder to begin with, without a loss of life. Was to really allow this level of self-government. So that meant that pretty soon folks were forming football leagues and baseball leagues and softball leagues. Their football basically took over the camp even that first fall, with leagues down for kids as young as elementary school age up until folks in their 30s and 40s were playing football. And they created these teams based on geographics. So if you grew up in the San Gabriel Valley, you're on one team. If you grew up in LA, you're on another team. If you grew up in Mountain View, you're on another team. And all these teams played each other. And then eventually they realized, well, we got 1,000, 2,000 teenagers here. And we have a high school. So that first winter, they scheduled a few games, a few basketball games, but they had no indoor court. So they had to go play these white high schools in neighboring towns. And they got just clobbered. They got clobbered. And then the next fall, there was some talk, a new, basically everybody at the high school that was a teacher at the high school were white, and they were from Wyoming and Montana and Nebraska. And they got promised great salaries to come because they had to live there or live right outside of camp and leave their families. But the one white coach was a local from Cody, and he had some connections through the state. And so he was lucky, and he was able to sort of say, like, we got these kids, we don't really have a fall sport for them to do. Why don't we put together a football team? And, Babe, and it was Babe and two other players were the only players on the entire team that had ever played high school football before. So basically from the moment that the team that is announced that they're going to play high school football to the first game is 13 days. And you have basically Babe and the other two players and their coaches saying, okay, we're going to teach all of these other kids how to play football. And like you said, in a state that everyone loves football, and whether it's 6-man or, full field, it's a football state. And where Heart Mountain was, it was close enough to the Montana border that they were able to book Montana teams too. And I think pretty early on, as soon as the games started, they realized that they were just going to have to play a completely different style of football than all the other teams in Wyoming. And, a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were just much, much smaller than these guys from Wyoming. So you had some players on the team who are as small as 125 pounds, 118 pounds, playing center. And, so that it basically they just decided, okay, we're going to play a completely different style of football here. We're just going to play everything to be super fast. We're going to do a bunch of trick plays. And we're just going to use our size to our advantage, because obviously we're not going to be able to smash these guys to the ground off the line. So let's just use what we got.
And they dominated, they excelled. They blew a lot of the other teams away. They were totally surprised by this.
And I think especially that first season, because nobody knew what to expect. So the first season, no one knows to expect. They play a couple games, and basically it was against teams that were nearby and folks that maybe had a gap in their schedule. They said, okay, October 23rd, we don't got a game right now. And we know this white coach who's coaching at this concentration camp. Let's toss him a bone and we'll go play these guys and we'll get an easy win. And then, we'll head back to, Carbon County, we'll head back to Worland or Lovell or wherever we're going. And they got the exact opposite. They showed up, and every game was played in the camp. Every football game was played in the camp. So these teams would come into the camp and show up at the field, and there'd be 5,000 people lining the field, which I did some research on it, and I say it on here, but I think it's the most people that had ever been on that piece of land in human history, because no one had ever settled the land. The tribes always just sort of passed through it because of how terrible the weather was there. So you just sort of have this profound image of 5,000 people who have been held against their will, deciding, I guess we'll go watch a football game today. And their team just game after game, just dominating whoever shows up. And I mean, when I say dominating, there were some close games, but there were games where they won by 50 points or 60 points. And it just wasn't, nobody put up those kind of scores in football in Wyoming at that time. It was a totally different style of game. Most games people were winning 7-6 or, maybe 21-14. And not to give too much away, but there were some games where the Eagles put up scores that just weren't challenged for years in the state and had never been, other teams hadn't hit those point totals in years. So,
well, it's really, I mean, it's remarkable. It's making the most out of adversity and surviving. But to zoom back to the broader political context, one character that stands out in the book to me is he's a kind of frightening figure. Is Carl Bendetson, who is basically one of the masterminds of the whole incarceration process. The irony about Mr. Bendetson is that he is, I believe, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. Mm-hmm. And he ends up, so of all people, you think he would know what it would feel to be persecuted. Mm-hmm. But he turns into the most, can you describe him and some of his role, and also talk a bit more about the creation of the 442nd Regiment and draft resistance? Because you also have these young men who are subject to the draft.
Yeah, so Carl Bendetson grew up in Washington State, and like you said, he grew up in a family of Lithuanian Jews in a logging community that was, one of sort of those boom towns that, is just pure. There's so many. There were Croatians there were Finns there were Lithuanians there were basically every European ethnicity existed in this town. There were Chinese cooks, there were Japanese folks, and he basically, the lesson that he took from that and his upbringing was that he was going to deny that he was a Jew. He was going to change the spelling of his last name and create a whole false narrative that he was actually of Nordic descent. And then he got into the army, and he was working from Washington, D.C., and just had always sort of had this antipathy towards Japanese immigrants. And when he saw his opportunity to pardon my language, but to screw all these Japanese Americans, he leapt at it, and he hooked up with another military leader on the West Coast, John DeWitt, and they basically created this plan that fomented the whole process of removal and created a false narrative that the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were a danger to American society after Pearl Harbor. He's basically, Bendetson is at a luncheon on the day of Pearl Harbor in Washington, D.C., and gets the call, drives his wife home to Bethesda, and then goes all the way back to his office at the War Department and stays there for days. He prided himself on his ability to not sleep. And he would just stayed up for days and just built this plan that was basically a plan of ethnic destruction. And it didn't only entail Japanese, Nikkei lives. It was a destruction of Japanese and Japanese American culture in America. So whether that, life. So that was removal of Japanese American newspapers and typeface, and destruction of Japanese American records and heirlooms, and things that people that we hold dear, that we have of our grandparents or our parents, that there's generations of this that have just been lost in the Japanese and Japanese American community here.
Yeah, I think that it's unfortunately, people like this pop up again and again in history. And some people, I don't know if it's self-hate or who knows what, but the interesting thing is that a decent percentage of the young men in these camps, when they were found out that they were going to be drafted to fight in the army, some of them joined up with what became the 442nd. And another one of the masterminds of incarceration, John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, would later say, actually, that was one of the proudest things. One of the things I'm most proud of. So a
Yeah.
strange irony. So you have some of them who go off to fight and do, they're the most heavily decorated regiment of their size. They fought in Italy. Then you also had a group that resisted. Can you tell me sort of about the dichotomy of these two groups, the ones who joined the 442 and the ones who resisted?
Yeah. So at Heart Mountain, basically in 1943, pretty, not too long after the camps first opened, the federal government's trying to figure out ways to boost troop numbers, and they realize they're going to need more and more troops. So they devised this plan to ask for volunteers from the Japanese American camps, and the plan just goes south really quickly, especially at Heart Mountain, where very, very quickly a draft resistance movement is created and grows rapidly. And after that first volunteer movement, only a few dozen folks volunteer from the more than 10,000 people that are at Heart Mountain. And so the War Department goes back sort of with its tail between its legs and says, these folks they're not going to volunteer. And, right after Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans are basically declared as aliens and not allowed to volunteer for the Army. There were lots and lots of Japanese Americans who wanted to volunteer for the Army right after Pearl Harbor. And those Japanese American folks who were in the Army to begin with had their guns taken away and basically just became glorified cooking and cleaning crews for the rest of their comrades and soldiers in the Army. So then the Army, the War Department basically says, all right, well, now we're just going to reinstate the draft. So now you're going to get drafted from behind barbed wire.
We're drafted.
Yeah, you're drafting. You're from behind barbed wire, and that was when the draft resistance movement, especially at Heart Mountain, but in other camps as well, really kicked off. And that was basically a group that said, we are loyal Americans. We'll gladly fight for the United States. Either close the camps or give us some sort of understanding about where we stand on our own citizenship. Are we full citizens? Are we full American citizens? And if we are, why are we being held behind barbed wire? And this question is being held and being asked of the kids who are on this team, because they're 17 and 18-year-old high school seniors. So these are the folks that would have been sent straight to the front line. And you have some of them that, gladly volunteered and went and got their draft cards and got their physicals and were sent off. Folks that were sent straight to Italy, folks that were sent to military intelligence because of maybe some Japanese language skills. But then you also had Eagles who said, no, you're keeping me behind barbed wire. You're keeping my family behind barbed wire while you're going to send me to the boot of Italy to basically be cannon fodder. And I think that the difference, it was interesting to see who decided to join up and who didn't from a personality standpoint. And I think that, every man in that situation had to make their own decision. I say man, but, most of them were still boys at that point. They were high school students. And there's a lot of responsibility and there's a lot of weight that fell on them in terms of, do you stand up for yourself as an American, but your siblings are still going to be in a barrack in Northwest Wyoming.
We don't know how the war is going to end. They
don't know how the war is going to end.
They don't know if they'll have a home to go to.
Right.
And exactly. I think that was a big fear. It was like, okay, when we get it let out of camp, where the heck are we going to go? We've lost our homes and everything. And you follow also in the book what happens what happens afterwards. Mm-hmm. And there's some interesting trajectories, what happens to the Eagles after the war. But just looking at time here, I think one thing that we also need to address, this is a personal connection, is that you're a native of Hyde Park, New York, which is where Franklin Delano Roosevelt's estate was, a family estate. They've been the family for several generations on his father's side. And FDR is seen as the hero of modern liberalism. He got us through the Great Depression, World War II, but then he was no intellectual like his cousin Theodore. He was a very shrewd politician.
Yeah.
This was a piece of political calculus that ended up being extraordinarily cruel. It was advantageous. And he had no guilt for this. his attorney general, Francis Biddle of Philadelphia, like him, Harvard and Groton, and all the whole sort of upper class background. Francis Biddle, when he died in the 60s, apparently was beating himself up about this. FDR didn't have any. What does this say about FDR and your assessment of FDR, out of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, you grow up in Hyde Park. I mean, I went to FDR High School. The mascot was the president. Used to go there to his home and library on field trips. You would drive by it pretty much anytime I had to go to the grocery store. So you have this image of who FDR is as this sort of liberal lion with saving the country from the New Deal, with the New Deal. And, my middle school was built with New Deal funds, as was the post office. So you have this, you're sort of surrounded and encompassed in it. And, I still think that all of those parts of his legacy, I don't, I still support those parts of his legacy. But the more and more research I did on this, you just see how much this part, Japanese American incarceration should overshadow some of this legacy, where basically he essentially abdicated all responsibility on this, and sort of passed the buck. And as it climbed, as the executive order climbed from Bendetson and McCloy on the West Coast and sort of bounced its way up through the War Department, and then eventually, like you said, gets to folks like Biddle and Stimson, where Biddle has a really, his whole life really struggled with this. And I think that, like you said, Roosevelt never really did. He said, okay, make it as broad as possible, and make it, just do it quickly. And I think he wanted to put some blinders on about this. And, you see especially how it affected his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. Whereas before, she was viewed as a confidant and really helped steer some of his policy, she was totally blindsided by this. And their relationship never really recovered after she learned that he okayed this. And Eleanor Roosevelt pleads with FDR to let her go visit a camp, even asking at some point to have a Japanese American family come stay at the White House, which was obviously, completely, sort of pushed aside. And this is, and FDR, there's a lot of things. FDR never met directly with his second head of the WRA, for instance, Dylan Meyer. He never met with him, never spoke with him. So, I think this is obviously a black mark on Roosevelt. Like you said, you get down to his political shrewdness in 1944, when, whatever glimmer of military necessity this plan had with the military was completely expired. It was very clear that there was going to be no sort of Japanese or Japanese American espionage in terms of helping the Japanese war effort. They say, we should probably close the camps. We should close the camps. And FDR puts off the decision until after the 1944 election. And just a few weeks after that, that's when he closes the camps. And it was
the Japanese were just the Japanese Americans were still unpopular and despised by a huge. And it's important to know that even the ACLU refused to speak up. The only group that really spoke up publicly against this, tying us to Philadelphia again, was the Quakers.
Quakers, yeah.
And they sponsored, one of the reasons why there's a decent sized Japanese American community in Philadelphia is that a lot of the Quakers sponsored families to come live with them.
Yeah.
And I found out recently that at our son's school, two Japanese American students were sponsored to attend Germantown Friends, and they were the first students of color at that school, but they were treated as usual students. They were housed with host families, but they were plucked from these camps.
Yeah. If you look at the Quakers, and there were a few other Protestant denominations that helped, and a lot of folks in that, the Quakers especially, would send gifts to the Japanese American kids at Christmas in the camps, just boxes and boxes of gifts. So there was a lot of kindness there from the Quakers especially. But you're right, there was this there was still this overwhelming sense of otherness when it came to the Japanese in America and Japanese Americans that did not apply to German Americans, did not apply to Italian Americans. And there was a real true animus and a real sense of violence that sent them to camp to begin with, and then was waiting for them on the West Coast when they returned. It obviously wasn't, as bad as that when they left, but there was arson, there were fire bombs, there were people shot at when they returned back to the West Coast. And it was impossible for a lot of white Americans to separate the idea of Japan, the country, from Americans of Japanese descent. And you saw that across the country. You even saw that in places like Queens and New Orleans, where they were removing Japanese American history exhibits and every Japanese art and, things that, Japanese Americans were mostly on the West Coast at that time, but anything having to do with Japaneseness was viewed skeptically by the majority of Americans.
Well, Brad, I think we should be wrapping up soon, but before we take questions, what's one surprise that you found in researching this book? Something that really blew you away, whether it was interviewing people or something you found in the archives that blew you away. What was your biggest surprise writing Eagles Apart Mountain? Yeah,
this is a very, very small thing, but I always think about the National Archives still has basically, if you were incarcerated at a WRA camp, you had a file, and you had your health records were in there, and your everything, your school transcripts, and anytime you asked for leave from camp, and any sort of all these sort of loyalty questionnaires and things. And so I was at the National Archives in DC one day, and I was actually there with at the same time, just happened with the executive director of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center was there at the same time. So we would spend our days sort of going through the different files together. He was scanning and digitizing all the files for all the Howell Mountain draft resistors, and I was getting the football players. And I pulled a few of I pulled a lot of the players' files, but then I also pulled some of their parents' files too, to sort of get a sense of who their families were. And I still remember one very small note. It was probably only a paragraph long, but Babe Nomura's dad raised pigeons at their boarding house in Hollywood. And he just, used them as pets, and then used them for food. They would eat the pigeons. And his neighbors, right before the war, reported him to the FBI because they thought that he was raising carrier pigeons and sending messages to the Japanese. So you have this man who's just running a boarding house for single Japanese immigrant men, who is raising all these pigeons for his family to eat and as pets. And his neighbors look so skeptically at them and believe, so thoroughly that he must be a Japanese spy that they call the FBI and have him investigated for possibly training his pigeons to send messages to presumably the Japanese offshore. And the FBI came and said, case closed, he's eating the pigeons. So it's obviously something very small. It's not a big takeaway from the book, but I always think about that when I think about, just how unnecessarily terrified white Americans were of their ethnically Japanese neighbors.
And there's so many lessons for, what's going on now. I think that this is a very, very relevant book when we're dealing with these issues of race and immigration or whatnot.
Yeah. And not to go too far down that path, but, so much of what drove Japanese American incarceration was misinformation. And purposeful disinformation from newspapers and radios. And you have
William Randolph Hearst was a big spreader of that.
Yeah. And you have folks with as Hearst, the Hearst papers, and you have folks as high up as, as lauded in the future as someone like Walter Lippmann, who, sort of foments this. And that's exactly the sort of disinformation and misinformation that leads to what happened at the US Capitol yesterday. And I'm sorry if, I'm sort of wearing the day on me, but I couldn't help but watch yesterday and think like that this is the exact same sort of misinformation that led to 120,000 Americans being sent behind barbed wire, 80 years ago. So.
Well, Brad, you've done a marvelous job bringing the story of these young men to life, their athletic victories against and proving themselves as Americans during the worst of circumstances. And I think it's time now that we should open it up to questions. And we should let Beth moderate the questions here.
Thank you. Stephen and Brad. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've been, wanting to jump in and say, oh, wait, but, or how about, and it's been fantastic.
You should have. 3 people.
One thing I really want to say, Brad, is what I feel like you've really done with your book, and I know we have some of the family members and friends of these men who you write about who are here tonight, and I'm feeling, hopefully they will agree too, that you make them live. You put flesh and blood when the stories could have just been cut and dried, but Babe and Horace and all these young men come alive in your story, and the pain and the hopes and the dreams and the challenges that they face that are these big legal and political and ethical issues and questions for us to grapple with in our history and current and in our current way we are as a country really come to life. So I applaud you on a really beautifully written story. One person noted that this is the stories you say about following the money it should be better known, but is not as well known as it is. And I wonder if you came across, in noting that the following the money continues with the federal government and their choices of where to locate Japanese Americans in these federal lands, that are sort of far away, but not too far away from places that they hope that these truck farmers can irrigate and make fertile so that they can not only feed themselves, but other people. And then their goals, what if you want to talk about, because you get a little in the book too, what did the federal government hope to do with these lands where they imprisoned Japanese Americans after the war?
Yeah, so basically the federal government was looking for, like you said, like places that were nearby that they could transport folks to, but weren't near, a dam or a power plant or the coast. So, and then they're like, okay, well, what's land that we already own or we can buy for super cheap, that if we put these really good farmers on after the war, we can then sell the land and now it's fertile and arable and we'll make money off it. So it's basically, and you guys both know that the salaries that were paid to workers within the camps were pittances. And
yeah,
it's, but yeah, so that was basically the federal government expressly put this. This wasn't some sort of after the war. They're like, oh, we can make some money off this. Like pretty, early on in 1942, before the camps even opened, it was an express, command when they were finding the locations for these camps to say, what are some ways that we can monetize this on the back end, which is just, it's despicable. You're basically using slave labor, not prison labor, excuse me, because they were being paid. You're using prison labor to make your land. And it's no different than how we, get our license plates or how our highways are cleaned today.
Yeah, so it's every way you slice the story, you just you dig up more and more that does not reflect well on our country.
And it put and at the same time it really put the Japanese American community in a hole after the war, because if you're only making $16 a month or $12 a month in camp, you have no way to, and maybe you're still, if you found a kindly person to be able to watch your house while you're in camp, you're still making those mortgage payments with a salary that's a tenth of what you were making when you lived in Los Angeles or Mountain View. So the return after the war, it wasn't for decades that the Japanese American community reached even the pre-war levels of economic security.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be helpful, the question here, if you want to, would you explain a little bit more about the exclusion zones and how it was determined what Japanese Americans had to go into concentration camps and which ones were allowed to remain in their communities?
Right. So basically, if you lived in California, Washington, Oregon, and a small slice of Arizona, you were sent to a camp. And that was actually kind of a moving target at the very beginning, is that, some parts of Washington and Oregon, they had set up these two different zones where at first the federal government was just trying to get Japanese Americans off the coast. So they said, if you want to go to inland Oregon or inland Washington, you can do that. And, in my book, I read about one guy who took all of his life savings and bought a farm inland in Oregon. And then he goes back to get his family in Western Oregon, and then the order changes, and he has this farm that he's purchased with all of his money he can't go to, and him and his family are now going to get sent to a camp. So basically, if you were a Japanese American that lived in, say, Salt Lake City or Denver or Chicago, you didn't escape the racism that followed you, but you didn't have to go to camp. And you were still able to own your business. You're probably being monitored. You're probably being surveilled, especially if you were a member, if you're a community leader. And, sort of showing the true capriciousness of it, and that in that moment in American history, the most ethnically Japanese part of America was Hawaii. And the majority of ethnically Japanese in Hawaii aren't sent to camp. Because at that point, they'd been in Hawaii for so long that they were such an integral part of the economy of Hawaii that the military commanders in Hawaii realized that it would be devastating to many different industries in Hawaii if Japanese were sent to the camp. So, that example always just makes me think, like, if the area literally around Pearl Harbor, all of these ethnically Japanese don't have to get sent to a camp. These Japanese Americans don't have to be sent to a camp. But somebody who owns a cucumber farm in, Dinuba, California, is seen as a threat. It was so contradictory, like the federal government's response.
As we know, some of that land is in Mountain View. I mean, that's some of the most valuable land in the country.
Exactly. Yeah, that was the Yoshinaga family land. The strawberry farm, is now home to multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations, and they sold that for, I think, in total US dollars now, about $6,000, and it's worth about $3 million an acre now.
Yeah.
So, there was obviously some money made there along the way too.
So a question from Tommy wondering, so you sure you felt a great responsibility to the families you interviewed. Were they eager to share their stories, and have you been able to hear their reactions to the book?
Yeah, and I think she's on this call, and I think she gets a little embarrassed when I talk about this, but Babe Nomura's daughter, Jan Mori, was the first person I reached out to. And Jan really opened up the whole book for me. After I first reached out to her, and she, I guess, realized that I might do an okay job with the book. That's when she started calling other players' families and reached out to players who were still alive and sort of said, vouching for me. And without her help on this entire project wouldn't have happened. And then that opened the gates and opened the doors to the entire Heart Mountain community. So every year at Heart Mountain, there's still an annual pilgrimage at the campsite. And I started going to that every year. And I think that helped because I was able to meet new sources. And one of the characters in the book's named Stanigawa. And he spent his childhood in Hawaii and then moved to Los Angeles in elementary school. And obviously there's, a terrible irony there that if his family had stayed in Hawaii, he would have never had to go to a camp. But I would just happen to be at the pilgrimage one year, and I was sitting there flipping through a high school yearbook from Heart Mountain, and somebody asked me, what are you looking for? And also, I'm white and I'm not Japanese. So people always, especially my first year there, people are like, who's this guy walking around by himself who has no family here, is not Japanese, ethnically Japanese. So he's looking at me and I'm said, oh, I'm working on a project about the Heart Mountain Eagle football team. And he says, oh, I think Uncle Stan played on the team. And then all of a sudden I was surrounded by Stanigawa's whole family. And that opened up a whole separate part of that. And I have spoken to, most of the families that I talked to and reported on in the book. And actually, I almost never do this with stories, but I sent them the manuscript when I was still working on it in one of the editorial stages and said, this isn't my story. Like, you allowed me to tell your family's story. And if there's anything that you see in here that's factually incorrect or tonally incorrect, or you think isn't fair to your family, isn't fair to your father, your uncle, or your husband in some way, please let me know and we can talk about what that means and what I screwed up and where I failed. And there were times where I had conversations with folks where they're like, we see why you said this. It's okay, leave it in. Or, things that people thought funny that, in speaking with the families, there's a certain sensibility and there's certain honesty that only comes from certain family members. Like, I spoke to Stanigawa's sister, and like there's a relationship there that a brother and sister have that's different than a husband and wife might have or a spouse might have. So seeing that perspective was always really helpful.
I've been there, Brad, where you send in something to family members because what you're doing shows tremendous respect, I think, especially given what happened. Because this is their honor and their lives here, and I've been in that situation too, where you send in to a family member or to send in, is this about right?
Right.
And you're waiting, you're nervous, you're waiting. Yeah. If you get an angry response or, whatnot.
And I've talked about this a lot, but I don't think a day passed where I didn't worry that I was screwing this up. And, this isn't my community. I'm not Japanese American. But I worked really hard to try to tell this story with the honor and respect that it deserves, and to honor those families that entrusted me, for the most part, with the first time of telling their families' stories, especially at this wide of a audience. So I thank them with my whole heart, because this would not have been possible, and I wouldn't have done the book without them. So
we have two last questions for you. One's from David, wondering if you came across in your research on this book anything that caught your attention for maybe another book dealing with the incarceration of Japanese Americans.
Not another book on Japanese American incarceration, but there's one sentence in the book that I started researching a whole other book on that lightly touches on Japanese American incarceration. That's obviously why I know about it, but I'm not going to give too much away because I think my agent's on the call, and he'd be upset.
Yes.
I think he'd be upset if I told everybody else about this idea before I told him.
That's judicious thinking, Brad.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's going to be calling you tomorrow morning.
This is still my job. So.
Well, I have one last question. Is there one misconception that you keep coming across in your interviews and your conversations with people about the Japanese American experience that you really wish you could just put to bed and clear up once and for all?
Yeah, and I think that there is still some generational divide even among Japanese Americans about the thing I'm about to say, which is that there was this expression shikata ganai, which basically means for lack of a better term, we had to endure, we had to go through with this experience.
I've heard that a lot growing up, by the way.
Yeah. So you have to say but it also sort of lends passivity to the Japanese American community and says that they just let this happen to them. And from my perspective, in my research, especially when it comes to draft resistance and this football team and the sort of the uprising at Santa Anita, you just have to sort of say, no, I don't buy that argument. I don't buy that these folks just rolled over. I think that there was a sense that this was the thing that they're supposed to do as Americans. But there was also a fear there, like, how are we going to defend ourselves if we don't decide to do this? And so that's one thing that I think gets lost in some of the other literature that's out there, and it changes. It changes, over the course of researching this book. I read books from the 40s and 60s and 80s and up until now, and you sort of see the argument, and you see how these books are written, and the focus, and how the focus changes from top down or bottom up. And I know that's the way that history is sort of changing, and how we teach history and how we write history. But I think especially when it comes to this chapter in American history, I'd really like people to give more credit to the community for A, how hard this was, and B, the fight that they really did put up once they were in the camps to make this a life worth living, and to fight for themselves and for every other Japanese American in the country.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. For everybody who came tonight, I hope you will buy the book and read it. Here you can get it on the athenaeumsbookshop.org website, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. I understand that this has been chosen as a book club reading for some public libraries around the country, even right now. So you may find that you have a book club that's reading it and talking about it. Hope you'll get the book. And I bet if you when we open back up again, we could probably find time to meet up with Brad at the Athenaeum and get him to sign the book. Invite you to become a member of the Athenaeum if you are not, and to join us in our upcoming programs. Next week, we have Dr. Kathleen Cahill to speak about her newest book about suffrage and how women of color helped to get the vote. And so we're looking forward to that talk as well as a noontime talk on Tuesday with Bruce Laverty about the Athenaeum and the early years of our residence at 219 South 6th Street. So look forward to seeing you. And again, on January 19th, you see up there my book club, which is really books that I'm reading and find interesting. We'll be reading another local Philadelphia author, Michelle Harper, The Beauty of Breaking, about her experience as an emergency room doctor. Another incredible book. Look forward to seeing all of you at future programs. And Brad and Stephen, look forward to seeing you again at the Athenaeum when we're able to open up our reading room to you all again. Thank you, and invite everybody to give a virtual applause for this fantastic, fantastic talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Are we still on? Hold on one second.
We have about 25 households, 24 households. People are starting to leave. That was great, you guys. That was really a fascinating, wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you, Brad, for writing such a phenomenal book. And I was very touched when you said that when you